Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Bristol Poverty Institute conference, Poverty and the Sustainable Development Goals from the Local to the Global. I'm Lauren Blake, lecturer in human geography at the University of Bristol. I focus on agri-food systems based in the School of Geographical Sciences, and I'm chairing today's session on food, nutrition, poverty and the SDGs, Beyond Zero Hunger. My co-chair today is Maria Jesus Vega Salas. She's a PhD researcher in social inequalities in diet and health in the School for Policy Studies at the University of Bristol, though she's joining today from Chile, where she's been stuck for several months due to COVID, where she's from originally. And also together we lead the Bristol Poverty Institute's Food and Nutrition Research Cluster. Before I introduce our speakers and the session, a few words of housekeeping. This session is being recorded and posted on the BPI YouTube platform and embedded in the Bristol Poverty Institute website. So by attending, you're consenting to being part of this recording. Please ensure that you've added your name rather than being listed as guest, as the BPI team will be monitoring attendees and also need to know who is asking questions to our speakers later on. You'll be asked to ask your questions via Zoom's chat function, which can be found at the bottom of your screen. Due to time constraints, we may not be able to answer every question, but feel free to get in touch with the speakers after the session to continue conversation or link up with them at one of the virtual networking sessions. Just a word of courtesy, please be respectful, of course. All events at this conference are being monitored and we reserve the right to remove attendees whose comments are deemed offensive or derogatory. I'm sure that won't be the case today. And also please do engage with any online discussions via the Twitter account at Bristol Poverty and the conference hashtag BPI Conference 2021. So just a bit of a note about today's session. So our session includes some participation with a panel discussion and workshop. So we'll be starting with 10-minute presentations from each of the speakers and their two organizations, followed by 10 minutes of Q&A. There will then be some breakout rooms assigned at random in small groups, and we'll post some topic guidelines that you can base some discussion around for about half an hour. There will then be a short opportunity for feedback before closing. So I'm going to now hand over to Feeding Bristol, and we have Ped and Lucy from Feeding Bristol. So Ped Asgharian, I'll introduce both of them here and then they'll be sharing the next 10 minutes. So Ped Asgharian studied environmental sciences and spent a decade working in the operational and commercial management of small to medium-sized business in the food retail sector. He was then managing director of the community farm based nearby in Bristol, which also my local veg box, for 7 years. This is a community farm is a community supported agriculture and social enterprise working to revolutionize and innovate the food system for the betterment of people and the planet. He became the director of Feeding Bristol last year, and he's also founding member and sits on the board of Bristol Food Producers, an organisation aiming to upscale local food production distribution. Lucy Jackman is the community manager for Feeding Bristol, and she joined this following researching food insecurity in Bristol for her PhD. She therefore has a research background and has experience of working across different sectors with a particular focus on food systems and poverty. She's passionate about community development, collaborative working and local empowerment, and is supporting the co-production of Bristol's Food Equality Strategy and Action Plan and developing the Community Food Justice Network. And I will introduce Suzanne after their talk. So I will hand over now to Ped and Lucy.
Thanks, Lauren. Just share the screen. Okay, so whistle-stop tour of Feeding Bristol and what we do. Feeding Bristol was conceived in, well, it was conceived many years ago, actually probably about 5 or 6 years ago now, and was part of the pilot scheme for the Feeding Britain program, which started a few years back, and the idea being that Feeding Britain came out of a paper which was written that highlighted the growing insecurity, or the recognition of the growing food insecurity within the country. And the talks in Bristol came out when the mayor issued his pledge of no child and was going to go hungry in the city. And as a consequence, Feeding Bristol, through multiple stakeholder meetings, came up with the Healthy Holidays program, which has been running for the last 3 years. So we finally founded as a charity in 2018, and as I said, we'll touch on the Healthy Holidays in a minute, but that was the kind of flagship project that we're leading on, the idea that you've got this issue of holiday hunger where children are going hungry outside of school term, and there was nothing there for them. There was no activities and no food for them, which was a growing issue, which impacts somewhere in the region of 16,000 children in Bristol now. So I put the kind of initial, if you like, the pledge of Feeding Bristol, which is the idea that everyone in Bristol has access to nutritious and affordable food, and have the skills, knowledge, and are empowered to eat healthily. And this has sort of evolved over the years as we've grown as an organisation, and we've increased our remit, if you like, to work across multiple communities of interest. And our aims now are really to tackle structural inequalities in our food system and look to build a more inclusive and equitable food system that is representative for everyone. So we work on multiple levels in the city. We're quite a light organisation in terms of people employed. There's Lucy and myself, and we have a part-time community officer who supports Lucy in her role. And the idea is that we work through multiple stakeholders again in the city. So we work through community organisations, community groups, all the way up to the Bristol City Council, and we're looking at, in particular, the last 12 months has been a lot of short-term need with the response to COVID and the food provision that was needed there. But most of the time, we're trying to develop medium and longer-term solutions, looking to initiate and support innovative solutions to some of the ideas, how we can address and overcome the barriers that we've got in the city for multiple communities and some of the wards that rank highest in the indices of multiple deprivation to make a positive impact. Got a few examples here of some of the projects that we work with or have instigated. So we've got the Healthy Holidays project. As I mentioned, the last 3 years we've taken the lead on. Over the last 2 years in particular, we've the project has evolved. Over £100,000 has been raised for each year, and we work collaboratively across a number of stakeholders, including organisations like Playful Bristol, which help to coordinate the play sector and the youth sector as well, and the idea being that you've got both activities and food that go together, and this helps to address the issues I was discussing earlier around holiday hunger, where children are just going without food when they're not at school, when they're not getting their free school meal vouchers, and it's very targeted at the 13 wards in Bristol that rank highest on the multiple indices of deprivation. This year, you may or may not know, there's a lot of funding coming from the government now, the central government, the Holiday Activities Fund, and Bristol has a significantly larger amount, and we'll be hoping to do a lot more, where we will continue to take the lead role on food provision and appropriate food provision around the city. We've got the Children's Kitchen as well, which is a project that we run ourselves through the wonderful Joe Ingleby, and that's all about teaching children at the moment in earlier settings about the experience of food. So it's not just about cooking food, but it's about experiencing, understanding, growing food, feeling, touching, tasting. And we work with across other organisations like Fair Share, Family Action, to do the food clubs, food on your doorstep, which is a different way of approaching food provision in an affordable way. Which looks at using food waste predominantly that comes through the Fair Share system to provide people with up to £15 of food per week, which they only have to pay around £3.50, and that's aimed at families and children. But again, it's growing in remit, and there are now 15 in Bristol. Over the last 2 years, they've evolved, and there was only 4 to begin with, and we're also been a partner on Going for Gold for the last 2 years now, pretty much, as the city goes to become a sustainable food city, and the Gold Award. And our lead is the food equality section, which kind of ties in with the food equality strategy and action plan that we're supporting the council on producing. This has been it's a year-long process. It's going to be by the time we finish, but it's about addressing multiple stakeholders across the city. We've had 2 stakeholder group meetings and surveys so far. We've had key themes coming out of it around the fair access, choice, skills and resources, sustainable food system, and food being at the heart of decision making. So there's this idea that food sits across everything that the decisions that are being made by the council on infrastructure and throughout the city. And as part of this, we're trying to make sure that food equality becomes a policy in the council and also part of their new corporate strategy, which will be built following the upcoming election. So I'm going to pass over to Lucy now, who will explain a little bit more about some of the work that she does.
Hi everyone. So Ped's given us a really great overview of what we do and the projects we're involved with. So I just thought I'd give you a little bit of an overview of just sort of like the everyday, weekly, on the ground sort of things that we do to promote communication and collaboration across the city. So while we're involved with the public health team to create the food equality strategy, we actually work really closely with the community development team in the council to monitor food provision in the city, in particular focusing on the 13 most deprived wards in Bristol. So we have, as you can see, a screenshot on the left. We've got a really detailed Excel spreadsheet focusing on all of the different food projects that are in those areas of the city. And we basically have a traffic light system where we monitor, concerns and issues that are arising within those areas in terms of food, but also use that space to problem solve and to look at things from that operational level. That kind of weekly monitoring then feeds into fortnightly meetings with a wider group of food organisations such as food banks, the National Food Service, food clubs, which we mentioned earlier, and FareShare, among other organisations. And we use that to then discuss, food strategy in the city. And it also feeds into fortnightly meetings with community anchors from different parts of the city that are working in localities, so locality based, really rooted in with different community groups. And it's not just a one direction, communication. It's also each of these groups are really essential for feeding into what we know and how we identify issues and how we problem solve. So it all kind of works quite cyclically. And then I was also just going to say that actually quite a lot of what we've done through those groups, problem with having someone else control the slides, what we do within those groups is also just, it's primarily emerged through the COVID-19 pandemic, these group meetings. But what we found is that there's such wonderful ways of promoting collaboration and communication across Bristol that we're going to be continuing with this as our sort of standard mode of working, essentially. Next slide, please. So in addition to these ongoing monitoring and update groups, we also have strategic working groups that are focusing on particular vulnerable groups in the city. So we have working groups, for example, looking at older people, disability, the homeless sector, refugees and asylum seekers, and children, young people and families. I'm basically just reading that list. But what we do really with these groups is we want to, the basic aim of those groups is to ensure that there are conversations happening across the city looking at these particular vulnerable groups to ensure that, food is actually on people's minds and that there is a focus there. But within each of these groups, we develop the strategic aims collaboratively. So some groups are at different points in their journeys at the moment, but, for example, with our children, young people and families group, we're already coming up with, we want to have a strategic, a strategy and an action plan for the city for how we work with food in the sector. So, they're places where those kinds of conversations can happen. And importantly, we also don't necessarily have to hold those conversations ourselves, because like the food and the homeless sector working group is actually held by a homelessness charity called Caring in Bristol, who convene that. So it's, feeding into various different places. In addition, we also have task and finish groups, which are more objective based. So you've got we're at the moment we're having a bit of collaboration with different organizations in the city to look at food asset mapping and how we can share and signpost what is available in the city in the most effective way, and use that also as a tool for collaboration and creating new partnerships. Next slide then. And importantly, these working groups, what we want to do is feed into this next steps exciting project, which is the Community Food Justice Network, which we're going to be launching in June. And this is a quarterly meeting or forum for different organisations across Bristol who are working with food to support people in different capacities. So it's open to all organisations that are providing food aid, but also interested parties as well. And it's a space where we can network, share, and learn from one another. And the purpose is to look at alternative models of food provision, highlight key concerns within the city relating to food, and essentially just to really promote that communication and collaboration. And it is, in addition to actually having those meetings themselves, we're also going to, ensure that there's promotion of different organisations through blogs, which will be providing content for different organisations across the city and really trying to showcase what's happening here. So yeah, it's quite exciting.
That's great. Thank you so much. And it's always I always learn a bit more about Feeding Bristol whenever I'm involved in anything. So always good to learn more. I'm now going to hand over to Suzanne, Suzanne de Berg, who is joining us all the way from Arizona in the US. And she comes from the organization Seeds for a Future. So she's the co-founder and president for Seeds for a Future. The name is Spanish, which is Semillas para el Futuro, which was founded in 2006. It's a US nonprofit with its sister organization in Guatemala, Semillas para el Futuro, and they have been working since 2006 to help families in rural Guatemala improve food security and nutrition. So Suzanne has been involved in the sort of basic goals and structure of the overall program and overseeing US and Guatemalan operations, including management and performance of education programs in the field. She'll be explaining in her talk much more about what they do. She's also the person primarily responsible for financial affairs, needs assessment, administration of grants and forward planning, and consults with a panel of experienced educators, business people, agronomists, healthcare providers, and Guatemalans who are experts in anthropology, sociology, and culturally sensitive and practical field strategies. She also maintains information exchange and co-supportive relationships with leaders of various allied NGOs focused on nutrition, women's health, agronomy, environment, and community leadership development, in particular for women and youth. So I will pass over to Suzanne and she will tell us all about Seeds for a Future.
Good morning, well, it's morning for me, sorry. Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to be here. I want to thank Lauren and the Poverty Institute for inviting me to talk about Seeds for a Future. I enjoyed the presentation we just had, partly because although you're dealing with the same fundamental issues, it's a completely different environment in many ways than we are accustomed to because we are working with rural Guatemalans. What I plan to share with you is a summary of the growth and evolution of our program since our founding 15 years ago, and how we came to focus specifically on working with families to give them tools for improving nutrition and food security so that they can build for themselves better lives. First, our first activity was to have meetings with leaders, people, experts, experienced people that we thought could help us avoid problems. Then we had community meetings in Chocola with people there, citizens of the community, to solicit input and find out what the interests were. And then we did a couple of small get acquainted projects with in the town so that they would get to know us. Initially, our ideas had to do with helping the people of Chocola lift themselves out of poverty by focusing on putting on their assets of history and environment, which were substantial. And so we thought of developing tourism business. However, as you might realize, successful development of tourism businesses requires group efforts and perhaps months or years before the benefits would accrue to the families in question. So we decided that we had to do something else, because we soon realized that it can be very difficult for people who are living in severe poverty to visualize and plan months or years into the future. Because when you struggle to feed your family, the concept of long-term planning shrinks to a couple of months at the very most. So our main focus became trying to help them build better lives. Another issue that we ran into is that subsistence living makes a person's outlook much more oriented towards their family than towards community or group activities. Other issues arising in Guatemala from the broader societal context, including unmet SDGs, can have had an impact. Decades of authoritarian rule, discrimination, and marginalization of the very large indigenous population there, failure to develop strong civil and democratic structures, hyper-patronism, I've called it, in government and private sectors, especially in rural and agricultural areas where the patron at whatever employment was available governed everything. And breathtaking levels of government and private corruption, which left citizens with very little positive experience of successful policies in or services in health, education, justice, or in even access to healthful food. In Chocolat, where we specifically worked, it was exacerbated by cultural dislocation, persistent distrust following the Civil War period. You may remember that was 36 years, very terrible time. Interreligious quarreling, parochialism, and destructive clannish gossip. And all those contributed to community fragmentation and dysfunction. With all of this taking place in the context of endemic poverty and very high and seemingly intractable levels of, malnutrition. You may already know that Guatemala has the 6th highest rate of chronic malnutrition in the world. And this rate is even higher in rural areas, especially among women and children. So we decided to focus on malnutrition, food security, and poverty as the best way to fulfill our desire to try to help the people of Chocolat have better lives. Our behind the scenes goal was to create a program that might be applicable in other areas. So we focused on Chocolat as our development and learning site. We settled on a grassroots methodology, working directly with families, since local cultural roles are strongly correlated with the 2 most fundamental SDGs: men bearing primary responsibility to produce family income, and women's roles in the home and family appropriate for addressing food security and malnutrition. So we were going to diversify farm crops with the men, and then fight malnutrition, and then provide other income from the family gardens. So starting with our men's program, we promoted a sequenced conversion of at least some portion of their farming practices, their farming parcella from coffee to cacao, which produces a higher value crop with roughly the same amount of work. And cacao is a native tree better suited to the environment around Chocolat. More than 12,000 cacao trees were planted and 8,000 other types that would increase crop diversification or reduce the cutting of more valuable trees for use as firewood. However, despite the number of trees planted, the men were reluctant to adopt the program wholeheartedly. For one thing, family income benefits would be 3 or more years in the future from the cacao. And as their family's primary producer of cash income, shifting to something new seemed really pretty risky. Now the cacao trees, other diversification efforts, technical training are yielding positive results. So the farm program has gained its own momentum. With the women, we initially promoted family nutrition gardens. They were grown around the home, and home-related learning topics such as nutrition, kitchen and food handling, hygiene, family first aid, and so forth. A nutrition garden represents little financial risk and equally important, it can provide both food and the satisfaction of accomplishment in a fairly short time frame. Also, the women are generally very responsive to learning opportunities because they have had so few, and they also are eager to become seen as productive in the family, as opposed to simply asking for money. In 2016, we began formalizing the inclusion of animal protein sources into the program. We strengthened our efforts to involve all members of the family in this program and broadened the scope of the integrated learning topics. The garden program evolved then into our backyard farm, or Casa Granja, the main features being gardening, raising small animals, really trying to convert wasted family resources of space or objects to use them productively. It needed to be affordable, low cash outlay by the family, and then we promoted recycling and composting and so forth. Participation in the Casa Granja program lasts 12 months with weekly in-home coaching visits so that the family has guided experience over a year of seasons and the life cycles of various plants and animals. The weekly visits are provided by our local extensionists whom we have trained, and they share their skills and knowledge with the families, coaching them and supporting them as they use what they are learning, the basics of plant and animal husbandry and nutrition, plus the skills of decision-making, planning, experimentation, problem solving, and so forth. You can see that the extensionists are trained not only in the technical training, but in various other aspects that are really important to the family development. The main components of the Casa Granja program start out with initial planning, which is conducted with each family, where we, in some ways, help them visualize what they can do with their own existing resources. Then, as I said, accompaniment over 12 months, weekly household visits, plus periodic small group meetings and activities, in-home one-on-one learning sessions, and integration with other topics. The small group meetings take place in the homes of participants or at a nearby demonstration site. Sharing of stories and experiences encouraged, and they're a very effective way of building neighborhood cohesion. What makes our approach different? As our programs evolved, we developed three main concepts: integration, flexibility, and accompaniment. Excuse me. I'm going to spend a little bit of time here because we believe that it's these concepts which differentiate SEEDS from other NGOs operating in Guatemala, of which there are many, and many in the rural areas. Over the time that we developed our programs, we found that for learning to produce sustainable results, it has to be connected to the varied and complex realities of the daily life of these people that we're working with. It must be specific to those people and to the environment in which the learning occurs. And there must be sufficient time and support for the learning and the associated behaviors to become embedded into a new daily reality. So, for example, agronomy knowledge is integrated with education on nutrition, hygiene, protecting the environment, micro-entrepreneurship, and many other topics, most of which are found within the other SDGs. Flexibility is vital for success. Every village is different as to culture, history, economy, environment, geography, even language, just as every family and its space and resources are different. A top-down, one-size-fits-all, excuse me, I've jumped, one-size-fits-all method just simply doesn't work. The concepts and methods of our grassroots approach can be applied anywhere, but the details of what is taught must be adapted to the location and the people you plan to assist. Accompaniment, gosh darn it, my mouse is anxious to get to the next slide. So accompaniment may be the most important of these concepts. Coaching and accompaniment occur over at least 12 months in the Casa Granja program, allowing family members the time to acquire the skills, experience, and self-confidence they need to apply what they've learned and develop new attitudes and habits that will create sustainability. Follow-up research a year after families have graduated shows that over 80% continue to implement some or all of their Casa Granja training even after the weekly visits have stopped. Our underlying emphasis is important as well. These next few slides are going to list different concepts which are important, many of which are inherent in the structure of program interactions. That is, we're not teaching, we're not holding classes on empowerment of women and youth, for example. And another example is, it's important for your team to model mutual respect, gender and age equality, bi-directional knowledge sharing. I'd also like to note that our families are participants, because to me, beneficiary is a top-down word that sets the wrong tone. Other factors, I hope that you will be able to read some of these as I try to dash through them and not take too much time. Train local people, for example, item 4. This creates much better community acceptance, provides jobs that are definitely needed, and results in a living knowledge asset in the community. And the other thing I think is really important is use appropriate learning techniques. People with limited experience of classroom schooling, especially in areas where education is of very poor quality, learn by doing, or they learn by observation, by watching others do things. And it's also important that people experience early success. I mean, it's a silly thing to say, but planting radishes is really great, because radishes pop right out of the ground and off you go. And yet a few more things that we learned along the way.
Sorry, one more minute.
Okay, one more minute. I will just say that if you scan through this quickly, you can probably imagine some of the circumstances under which we learned the value of some of these concepts. In each new community or neighborhood, with each new family, we want to demonstrate that people that like themselves can be successful and take action to build better lives. Doña Dominga was one of our first participants, and she understood immediately. Giving you a second to read her perfect words. We are successful and we are growing. We have gone from 15 families in one community to having directly served close to 2,000 families in 14 communities, approximately 15 individuals, without accounting for the effects of knowledge sharing neighbor to neighbor. We are scientifically proven, and we're very proud that INCAP conducted an independent research project. INCAP is the premier nutrition institute of Central America, founded in 1949. It's funded by Nestle Foundation of Switzerland and covered 30 months in 2014 to 2017. And we're grateful for the support of these organizations, but we need to especially acknowledge the dedication and hard work of our project manager, Armando Astorga, and our field team, plus the guidance and friendship of many individuals and NGOs. And if I run out of time, I run out of slides.
That's great. Thank you very much, Suzanne. Thank you very much to all three of our speakers. Really appreciated you taking the time and sharing your work with us. So we have about 10 minutes now for questions before we go into smaller breakout rooms for discussions. If you have any questions, please use the chat function at the bottom of Zoom to submit your question. Hopefully you already have your name listed there, rather than just being a kind of anonymized guest or some kind of code name. And if it's for specifically either Feeding Bristol, Ped and Lucy, or Suzanne with Seeds for a Future, please indicate that. Otherwise, we'll assume that they're for everyone. And I'll let few minutes for people to kind of type those in, because sometimes it takes a while for them to all come in. So please do get typing. And I'm going to take advantage in my position as chair to ask some of my questions, my own questions. So if that's all right. So I had a question for all of you actually, which is actually it's kind of twofold. So you're all working in very specific locations in a kind of very defined communities, even though they're very different contexts. How do you address and work around the larger structural issues that are at the core of a lot of the problems, and the largest barriers to change? And I appreciate that you're all doing brilliant work, and the emphasis is very much on it sort of being locally appropriate and embedded, which is probably part of the answer. But yeah, how do you work within the limits of these structural issues that are really the source of these food problems?
Well, I will just jump in if that's okay. I think we have, in some ways, a situation where a lot of the contextual issues that Ped and Lucy talked about in terms of government, other associations working in the same direction, so we don't have that. I mean, the things that I mentioned, it prejudices, the marginalization, corruption, decades of being ignored by a corrupt government, poor, terrible education. I could go on. We just have to ignore those things and get on with it. That's why a grassroots approach is so much better for us, because you can't work well. It's very difficult to work with the government. They are so corrupt that then they over bureaucratize everything to see where did every penny go, to make sure that we're not taking money while they're driving cars that have been funded by US aid. I mean, so we are very aware of those contextual issues, but only how they have affected people's lives and willingness. I mean, one of the things I've emphasized in the presentation is in sort of underlying, is that people in Chocola, suspicious of outsiders, clannish, fearful, old, they were culturally dislocated. Their grandparents and great grandparents were moved from another language culture area into that area. They lost over time their sense of confidence that they could change anything about their lives. And that's why all of our programs are kind of have these underlying directives that people can learn things that will help them. So our context is completely different from the other. And yet there are, I don't know, thousands of rural communities in Guatemala suffering the same problem and open to the same sources. I mean, the same resources, if there were people who could afford to provide them. So
it's funny actually. I could have. I think many people here think that we have quite a corrupt, difficult to work with government and local authorities as well. It's not particularly easy here, and I think one of the, there's so many levels of. I mean, to check, there's no one from the council on this call. Lucy and I have been having with this food equality strategy and action plan. It's an interesting process of both of us engaging with the council at a local level on trying to create an action plan, a strategy, and a policy that's gonna be embedded within the council themselves. But yeah, so surprised at the level of bureaucracy that's needed, the loops you've got to jump through to get the tiniest things moved, and then actually the kind of the blocks you face when it's still that thing of like this whole career politician. Are people, I mean, again, this is a bit deeper than just food, but there's lots of blocks and places to do people really understand what's going on in the city and in the cities around the country, but in the city on a local level as well? And do they get the issues? Do they really understand the issues? I know that your local authorities are split out into all these different sectors which have their perceived experience. I think a really good example was at the mayoral hustings last night in Bristol. We've got the mayor election coming up in a week, and there was a question that I had in there about food systems and making some change, and all of the candidates gave such poor answers that where you just think you don't have a clue. You really don't have a clue. And then you talked about some of the mistrust that you experience, Suzanne, but we get the same sort of thing in Bristol as well, and some of the communities of interest, those that have been neglected, those that have suffered from institutional inequalities that have existed for so long in this country, where we've got so used to not questioning it, and they've got so used to that situation that they don't even bother putting their hand up or asking for help anymore. It's difficult to engage in some of the support sectors that are trying to help. It makes it very difficult, especially when some of those communities, are not of a white origin, and a lot of the support and aid that's been coming has been predominantly from a white background to begin with, and from a very white perspective. Then some of those communities feel really disconnected and unengaged with it. So big part of the work that we're trying to do across the city, we're trying to. I talked about building an inclusive food system, and that's really about the engagement and how we're talking to people, it's I think of not talking to, not trying to create stuff for, but actually having conversations with and listening, and how you then build that into the plans, giving people representation in these conversations. It's not a case of groups. I spent the majority of the last decade working at the community farm, as you mentioned, Lauren, and we would go, often I would find myself in all these echo chambers around Bristol with the same sorts of people having the same conversations, and I'd be there going, anyone other than me that's not white in this room, and everyone go, oh yeah, no, we need to address that, but that not actually happening, and being almost 10 years later and nothing changed. So there's a lot of this, a lot of these problems exist in this country, and it's really different. Lucy works on the ground with a lot of the communities. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Lucy, but it's really difficult kind of changing perception for those communities that aren't engaging in these issues, and then actually getting those that haven't been listening to listen, and then get them all in the same room to start co-creating, collaborating together to create this future, because that's the only way we're going to do it, is if we work together and we create the future plan together, these systems together. I feel like I might have waffled around your question, Lauren. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I really answered it.
No, it's great. Lucy, did you want to add anything? Otherwise, I was going to hand over to Marie, who I know has some questions too.
I think Ped waffled enough. I think I'm good. Don't you worry.
Well, thank you so much for your presentations. Were really, really interesting, especially after if some of the participants were in the previous session about food insecurity, much more in a research way of presenting data of what is happening in certain context. To have this in depth of how local NGOs are trying to tackle this issue, even with the structural, all the structural problems that we're facing in so different contexts that we are embedded in. My question basically was much more of if you could just talk about how your work has changed since the starting of the pandemic, since last year. I know that some of you mentioned something, but if you could deepen a bit more on that, on how the needs and the demands have changed or not at all, or how has your work changed since last year?
Well,
I'm sorry.
that's okay. You want to go?
I was just gonna simply say that Ped and I actually started our roles in September and October respectively. So in terms of personal experience of it on the ground, we wouldn't be able to reflect too much on what Feeding Bristol was like to work for before, but there's certainly been, through the work that we're engaging with, clearly so much more collaboration that's happening within the city itself. I was in a meeting this morning, and which was the community exchange meeting that I mentioned in the presentation, and we had a really amazing co-production kind of like workshopy session where we were talking about the future of the group and reflecting on the group itself over the past year, and how so many people were commenting on, it felt before that we had the VCSE sector and we had the council, and now we have such good working collaboration. We actually have a space where we can talk and feel like we're part of the same team. So I think there is that that's happening, but there's still so much to do, so much to do. But you know, we're at least at a point where we've got a platform on which we can work from, I think. So yeah.
Well, in Guatemala, the situation is in some ways, well, I won't say peculiar, but you know, it's a small country. There's no money to go to programs and so forth. The health system is a crashing disaster. But in the rural areas, initially the pandemic did not hit hard at all, partly because it's rural, people were outdoors and so forth. And there were some travel lockdowns, and even some of the tiny communities just sort of put people at the road and said, you can't come in, you know, no regard, you know, so there was some restriction of transmission of the disease initially. Unfortunately, that transmission has now, in a sort of second wave, reached into the rural communities, and that's made it considerably more difficult. We have always, our team has followed all of the COVID protocols and so forth, masking, and those are not followed very religiously in the rural areas at all, partly because of lack of education and so forth, and lack of experience, because there was not that much contagion affecting them. But what we did ourselves was, the extensionists who ordinarily would go to a person's house, look at the garden, see how the animals were doing, talk to them about any problems and so forth. They would go and make some observations, then, and without interacting, and then go home and call the families and give the coaching and so forth over the phone. So that was the primary way. But how it affected the families was very interesting. The price of things that they would still have to buy, beans, rice, flour, you know, those kinds of things, skyrocketed. But those families who were in our project did so much better than other families because they were growing food right there in their homes, or around their homes. It made a big difference in not only the actual actual food availability, but in their sense of comfort that they weren't going to just run out of food and starve to death. So it was a very positive experience in that regard, that people could really see in a dire situation, or what could be a dire situation, that this would help them in ways that they hadn't even thought about before. And as you know, for a while things opened up a little bit, but now it's more locked down than before, and we've had to be very cautious about sending our extensionists out. You know, local transportation is a big problem, because you know, 58 people in a minibus, you know, driving from one little spot in town to another has got to be, you know, not socially distanced. Nobody's wearing a mask. They can't do that. Walking takes too long. It's a tricky business, but it's going well. And the extensionists, they're great. They love their jobs. They love working with their community and helping them. So it's been that part of it has been rewarding. So it's worked.
Great, thank you. I'm just aware of time and making sure that we all have time with the breakout groups for some decent discussion. So what's going to be happening now is that all the attendees are going to be automatically allocated into, I think we're going to have about 3 groups, breakout groups. We have some guide questions as sort of discussion topics. So I'll post them all here now, but I think you'll be given just one or maybe 2 to focus on. And what's also going to be happening is that Maria and I, Lucy, Ped and Suzanne will all be joining some of the groups as well. So each group will have at least one of the chairs or speakers in there as well. We're going to have until 1:45, so about 25 minutes. There'll be a 2-minute warning. So yeah, once those 25 minutes are up, you'll automatically come back to main room, and we'll have a very, very quick sort of roundup feedback session. And before we close. So thank you again to all our speakers for their presentations, and I'm hoping that this produces some good quality discussion as we go into the groups now. So we'll bring everybody back.
Okay, so very quick. I mean, I think we need to change that wording, that corruption. Corruption is everywhere. So why is it that some countries are suffering so much? I think there's something going on in countries like in Africa, you know, low-income country. It's worse than corruption. So we need to find a better word for it. You know, we have to stop using it. The corruption is too lenient. Corruption is too lenient a word. Yeah,
I think, well, as everyone is getting a flavour of some of our discussions, we were ending up talking quite a lot about corruption. Thank you, Dave. That was great. Okay. I think we're just everyone. I think is now back in. So
okay.
A few.
Nice talking to you, though.
Thank you, Dave.
Okay.
So we have just a couple of minutes for any wrap up. So I'm going to give just a couple of bullet points from my group, if they're okay with that, and just as also to try and keep the time down. So I think we've got about 1 or 2 minutes for each of the groups to give any highlights on topics. We were focusing on the question, what is needed for grassroots interventions to be sustainable in all ways, that is, in tackling food security and malnutrition. Some of the points that we made were about the importance for partnerships and kind of fluctuations in budget, and the budget sort of being very unreliable. And one of the biggest problems is this sort of volunteer dependency, which is unsustainable, and it's, you know, very exclusionary for who is able to then be running things, and for environment often being the kind of environmental sustainability side often coming in as a sort of luxury, because you often need the other things there before you can even get to that, and the need for structural support. But yeah, if all of these things can be in place and they're supported and they're funded and supported, then once there's a sort of tipping point, all of the various benefits start to grow and spread in lots of different ways, covering the sort of social and environmental components. So yeah, and I think our kind of semi-joking short answer was, you know, something that was a bit closer to socialism, basically, and restarting the entire political system and economic system. Anyway, I'm going to pass it over to Maria Jesus for just a very quick synopsis of their group.
Yeah, so we discussed the same question, sorry, only because we had Suzanne there, and Suzanne will give us some hints, a brief summary of what we discussed, mostly about her experience in Guatemala. You're muted, Suzanne.
So I would say that we agreed with the points that were discussed that Lauren mentioned that were required. And I also agree with, I think it was, I don't remember, was his name David, who squeezed in a few words about corruption, and that a different word needed to be used, that it's beyond my ability to pop up with a good word at this point, but I agreed there. We talked in our session about what our group had found important to creating sustainability, and that in our case, it was heavily oriented towards education, because it is, in our case, up to the people in question that you're trying to help to learn those techniques for themselves. And we also talked about, Remo talked to us about how things had been in Italy and the effects of the pandemic, and how that might have changed things or not, and how those things affected the way we worked, and also the response of the participants, in terms of our participants being much more positive about their ability to survive through the increase in price of purchased food and the problems of the pandemic. I would be happy to have anybody who was there remind me of the other things. Oh, and David talked about one of the really important factors for us as a small organization is grassroots efforts. In order for them to be sustainability, the organization must be sustainable. And that's a question for us as a very small organization. So yeah, I'd be happy if anybody had come up with a solution or even some suggestions.
Thank you, Susan. I think you covered mostly everything we discussed. And we can go with the third group because we don't have much time. I'm only concerned about time.
Yeah, I think Lauren was potentially going to do a summary from that group. Lauren Winch. Sorry to put you on the spot, Lauren.
I thought Lucy was kind of leading the discussion there. I'm afraid I hadn't been prepared to.
Sorry. No worries. Sorry.
I've got to admit, it was mainly a Q&A with Hugo. I just asked him loads of questions about food and nutrition, and we had a nice chat. It probably wasn't actually around the question you set for us all too much, but we did discuss similarities in the fact that, you know, there are driving principles around food insecurity and poor nutrition, around income and access and education, and yeah, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. Does anyone else from that group or any of the other groups want to add anything in just the last couple of minutes?
Well, I just wanted to say, perhaps, if you allow, from our group, we think, I'm going to say we think, we're talking about a global. There was a question on similarities and differences, and very unfortunate, words are becoming very similar and not in the right way, and some differences are disappearing, but also for bad reasons. So perhaps that's sort of a response to that question.
Thank you, Hugo. Was there anyone else who wanted to add anything before I do a sort of closing thank yous?
Obviously, if you let me talk, I'll fill up the space, but maybe people are tired of hearing about Guatemala.
Well, you know me, Suzanne. I'm never tired of hearing about Guatemala, but yes, I hadn't sort of explained to people that I had met Suzanne. We've never actually met in person, but we've sort of been in touch on and off for a number of years because I had done some research there many years ago. So it's a place very dear to my heart, and I've always followed the work of Seeds for Future because of that. Right, I'm going to, oh, my computer's frozen, which is not helping because I was wanting to make sure that I was giving the correct information before.
Do you want me to step in?
Yes, potentially. My computer's completely frozen. Oh, no, it's back, sorry.
No? Yeah, great. Go on.
Hear me fine still? Yeah, just the formalities to thank again all our really great speakers for their great presentations and sharing their work and spending their time to talk to us. And thank you also for the participants for engaging in the discussions and attending. And just a quick reminder, this event has been recorded and will be available via the BPI website soon, where you can watch it back and or share the link with friends and colleagues who might be interested. You can, of course, also catch up with any other conference sessions which you may have missed. As part of the online conference, Bristol University Press have created a virtual space so that they can connect with everyone they would have at the physical event. And they're offering 50% off a selection of the latest books, as well as free content from the Journal of Poverty and Social Justice. And the link to the page can be found on our 4 Waves event website at the bottom of the schedule tab. So after this final session now, we've got the networking via Remo, I'm never sure how to pronounce it, by the Remo platform, just for 5:30 until 7 for anyone who wants to hang out. Not quite the same as all mingling and having drinks together in person, but it's still a great opportunity to chat to everyone. And then the final day of the conference tomorrow, engaging with policy and practice session, session on education, and the closing sessions, building back fairer at the. So thank you once again, everyone. And if there's anything you'd like to share on Twitter or any other platforms, so it's at Bristol Poverty, and the conference hashtag BPI Conference 2021. So thank you once again to all our speakers and attendees, and Bristol Poverty Institute for hosting this all, and my co-chair Maria Jesus.